Welcome, dear health seeking friends. This is the 13th in the series on the wilderness, and we're going to talk today about a widely discussed concept in Chinese medicine, which is very often misunderstood because it is taken too much as an esoteric thing, while it is in fact a matter of common sense to think like that. When we are looking at the series as a whole, we see that we have started with discussing the concepts of wilderness, and we are now going to talk about the wilderness inside us, that is our gut wilderness. Insofar as we have been before, we have been discussing wilderness within the concepts of Chinese medicine and Daoist medicine, Taoism as a whole, and what it means for your meditation practice, what it means for your sense of wholeness in your health as a whole, but also what it means for our relationship with nature and how we benefit from that nature in many ways. Today we're going to talk about another aspect of that, and that is our gut wilderness, that is the wilderness inside our body, inside our belly and so on. This is an important aspect of our of the wilderness idea in Chinese medicine. I am aware of the fact that I talk about allopathic medicine, Western medicine in general, from a relatively enmity standpoint, in the sense that I do not agree with their method or their philosophy or something like this. Notwithstanding, like Chinese medicine, allopathic medicine sometimes saves lives, so you can't be absolutely against something. But you can understand that maybe some of the foundational ideas of allopathic medicine are wrong. Allopathic medicine started off as a sort of a holistic idea, and gradually it started to rely too much on the instrumentation to be able to understand what it means to be a human, or what it means to be healthy, or anything like that. It comes with all kind of assumptions, sort of a mathematics, you can say, of reality, and it started looking at people like they were objects. And at the moment when it started thinking of people as objects and diseases as objects, and immigrations in the body, and all kind of other things that have to do with disease as objects, then at that moment it became a mechanic system, and like I said before, we are not cars. And for this we have to ask ourselves a few questions. Hi dear friend, welcome in the second part of our discussion on the gut wilderness and the use of that gut wilderness and why it is such an important part. In the first part we discussed feng shui as negotiating something very important in the gut wilderness, namely that the existence of life is very closely interrelated with things like climate and geography. So nothing exists without its surrounding. We already talked about it before, that because of interdependencies, our interdependencies make that we only live in certain kind of condition. That's why in mountains you have particular animals, and in the sea you have other kind of animals, and insects, birds, reptiles, dinosaurs, mammals, all developed in relationship to the context that they live in, and that happens all the time. So you talk about diversification. At the moment when there was only the first creatures, and there were not just only one or two creatures, but they popped up everywhere, and then they came in interaction with each other, and some of them were eating others, and they needed to make sure that they didn't eat everything. So the fertilization cycle of animals increased by creating more babies, and the other one maybe decided to be culled in time at the moment when food supply was getting lower. They got less babies, and so on and so forth. So continuously nature is balancing each other, and this is what we're going to talk about more on this system, and we're going to talk about the harmonizing factors in nature, in Taoism, and in life as a whole. But there is another part of it, and that has to do with the immune system as a whole. And the immune system, as we nowadays understand it in biology, is that the immune system has actually three parts. These three parts, they are relevant, and they are relevant for a particular kind of ideas, because to a large degree, when people talk about the immune system, they only know or understand two parts. And these two parts that they talk about are usually the immune system that attacks viruses and bacteria, and the immune system that attacks parasites like all kind of worms and other animals that might invade our body. A lot of these kind of bacteria, viruses, and even the worms, they live in a relative harmony with our body. Sometimes when they get excessive, they do us harm. They can, for instance, cause anemia as a disease, like for instance, like how hookworms and flatworms and all kind of other things, they cause this. And some, like flatworms, they even cause exhaustion of the body because they eat our food supply. And in that sense, they're not always welcome. Not all parasites are equally welcome because we haven't found a real biological solution for them. But there's a third part, and that is a negotiating part, namely the part that actually negotiates between the different parts that are attacking our body and that are not attacking our body, or that can maybe be applied in a useful sense. And you can see that there's a lot of viruses and bacteria inside us who in the past invaded us. They have become part of our inner society, and as a result of that, we actually need them. We produce chemicals that are there only because of the virus, bacteria, and other parasites in there. And what we have done with modern medicine is we try to get rid of them. And to a large degree, the agenda was originally to get into a complete sterile environment, because they thought, okay, without all the viruses, bacteria and stuff like this, we can avoid infection. So just bomb the whole place with napalm antibiotics. But unfortunately, we have found out, to our shame and embarrassment, that just like destroying rainforests and ocean ecosystems and so on, eventually these things bite back. And like it says in the I Ching, when you go against Tao, within 7 days will let you know, and it will start punishing you one way or the other by doing things that are not really what we were looking for in the reason why we do these things. You have to realize that our modern Western society, or westernized societies also, they have in origin, they have a military background. Our culture is military. Our Greek origins, they are one of fighting tribes and conflicts, and everybody who is not a friend automatically is a foe. You can still see that in the American politics. You can see it in the politics that is westernized in Asia. If you're not a friend, you're a foe, you're an enemy. And that doesn't always work in the favor of the countries who see that, who practice that kind of philosophy. The disadvantage of these kind of things is that the reality of society is normalizing over time towards what we can call what has been there forever, probably. And that is namely that every area is an immigration society. When you look at the Neanderthals eventually started seeing the immigration of the Homo sapiens, and the Homo sapiens gradually became separated in different tribes from other places where other Homo sapiens came, and you got all kinds of nuances and differences in color and skin tone. And you started having all kinds of different languages and interactions, and then you started having nation states, and then you had conquest going outward, and of course immigration going inward. This is the same. I live in the Netherlands. The Netherlands has from its onset been an immigration country, because if we didn't have immigration, we wouldn't have developed ourselves from the tuckers that were living in the swamps of the Netherlands. We own our dikes and our rivers and our canals. Everything we owe basically through the technology we got here through immigration. So immigration is part of our life, and in our biology the same. You can better say that what we call our immune system, which is a military phrasing, should be called the immigration system. That means it wants to regulate whatever comes to our body. And yeah, sure, of course there has to be civil testing to see what something is useful for, but in general, why would the body waste resources about the lesson that it has learned from the beginning of its existence, namely that parasites and import are not always enemies, but in fact are usually very smart additions to our body, without which we wouldn't be able to survive. There are other systems in our body at work who work according to the same principle, and they are the principle of three. Namely, for instance, our fight or flight reaction. Our fight or flight reaction is a stress response, and it goes into stages, namely anxiety and so on, and it gets worse and worse and worse until eventually the heart feels threatened, and then you start sweating to get rid of all the annoying stress, and then it starts drugging you in the same way like how a pregnant woman is being drugged to be able to deal with the stress of birth. We are being drugged to deal with the stress of the fear of death, and then we think we hack the body by getting into this drugged state and we feel good, but in fact we're teaching the body that stress is very normal. And stress comes, as you know, in two different responses. In a fight or flight response, the drugs helps us to make these two choices, but it is the choice between one bad thing and another bad thing, because both are the result of stress. Stress that very often doesn't need to come so far as to become bad. Stress in itself is very helpful. I mean, when we are reading a book, we create artificial stress because of the storyline. We watch a TV program because of the storyline. We are excited and we enjoy ourselves. The excitement of conquering somebody to make love to, or to make your wife or husband, or anything like that. All these kind of things are positive stresses. Society, the world, wouldn't exist without stress. So in that sense, stress is not bad. But at the moment when it comes to that kind of excess, it becomes unnegotiated. And the third part of that stress response is in fact meditation. By meditating, you create a kind of calm and inner serenity inside yourself, through which you can look at the situation and say like, well, it is not worth the stress. I better avoid the stress by not doing this, not going to the gym, not going to a battlefield, not going to get involved in that argument or anything like that. Because it can only get out of hand once I get there. Or when you are having to fight, when you meditate, you create kind of calm inside yourself, through which you can observe the situation better, and as a result of that have more chance to win, because you are not getting excited from the situation, you're only getting tired maybe eventually, because you know the fight takes too long. In Taoism, we talk about three gods. We talk about the water god, we talk about the heaven god, and we talk about the earth god. These are the three messengers gods with which, of whom actually bring our messages in ritual towards the higher court or towards the underworld. And at the moment when we pray to these gods and we deal with these gods, there is the radical heaven and the radical earth, which are yang and yin in their most extreme, and then the water god, which is the god of our realm. This is the god that actually is negotiating between heaven and earth continuously. So it is continuously negotiating between extremes. In the same way, in our body, our immune system has this negotiating factor, which is negotiating between the management of bacteria and viruses and the management of other parasites as a immigration force that needs to find the proper place. So it does basically civil testing. It makes sure that everybody gets its part, and it also makes sure that the immune system is doing things right. Because if the immune system isn't doing anything right and we kill off some part of our parasites and our immigrants, or we send them away one way or the other, we make sure that there is no place for them. Yeah, sure, we lose a lot of weight because, you know, they're almost like half of our body weight inside our body because of their volume. But at the moment when we lose that weight, we also started creating all kinds of diseases that we can't deal with. And the most important part of that is that our immune system is being trained on dealing with particular kind of things, and when these things are not there and they are triggered one way or the other, they can't go off. And that means that if a new parasite comes in, something gets put on, and then when that is being resolved, then it can't go off because there's no negotiator who made sure that that new parasite is actually finding itself a place. We just killed it. That's basically it. It's like an American detective or an American Western. You don't deal with justice. No, you only deal with justice by shooting the criminal or the bad guy or the bad woman or anything like that. There's no negotiating about punishment or making right for your wrongs. No, there's just killing. The interesting thing is probably that some of the symptoms that we see with all these modern diseases like diabetes, schizophrenia, Crohn's disease, rheumatic arthritis, these are new patterns, and some aspects of it or some symptoms of it can be found all over history of humanity, of course. There's all kind of reasons through which our gut get influenced by our environment or by the things that we eat, and sometimes we just do things that are not really very good, and then as a result that we maybe vomit a lot or we have a lot of diarrhea, and as a result that we empty our inner biomes. And it's not just the one of our gut. Our body is full of all kind of cultures in our brain, in our muscles, in our lungs, in our probably there's no place in our body where there is not one form of symbiosis taking place with viruses, bacteria, and worms, and all kind of other what people used to call parasites. A medical approach was primarily a military one, and that military approach was like, okay, we go invade the body with medication and we're going to kill and slash and burn everything that wants to be terrible to us. Basically, we napalm the body, and then when the whole inner flora and so on is being gutted, then at that moment what will be left will be a healthy body. But unfortunately, it isn't like that. One thing, for instance, that researchers noticed is that in poor countries, many of the diseases that we call new or modern diseases, they just didn't occur. They were just too poor for the modern diseases. They were still living in relatively harmful circumstances, so they were still living punished by the old diseases, but they were not, living in, they didn't have the luxury of modern diseases. To call it ironically. In the same way, in many societies where there were still some industrial labor going on, you see that blue-collar workers, they are less likely to get these kind of diseases than white-collar workers. Because the white-collar workers, just because of the relative sterility and the cleanness of their environment, causes them to become vulnerable to these new diseases. When children are born, with a cesarean, because of not being dirtied up with all kind of bacteria during the normal birthing process, they lack certain kind of materials in their body, other animals and plants, that they get from their parents, or for the uncleanness of the environment and the struggle to get through the birth canal. And as a result of that, you see very often that people struggle with their health their whole life. What I did with my children, because they also had a cesarean, because they were twins and they were not allowed to have a natural birth, because then usually one dies. What I did is I overdosed on vitamin D, but I also let them play in the dirt all the time, so that they pick up all kind of bacteria and all kind of so-called harmful parasites, to make sure that their biome is as quickly developed as possible. It was not something that I planned out, but I noticed that in China there were a lot of different diseases at the moment when I came there first time, and I realized very much that the medicine is actually a dirty medicine, right? While Western medicine is a clean medicine. And you see that Chinese medicine is trying to make this change from dirty medicine to clean medicine, in the sense that it tries to take out the affected chemicals and put them into powders or tablets or whatever kind of things they try to make it fit in with the Western medical idea of hygiene. You see in Chinese culture, because of the increased well-being of people, that they also started having all these modern diseases. So that is one of the big victories of modern prosperity. But the dirty medicines, the natural herbs and stuff like this, they come with all kind of microbiomes of themselves, and they enrich the body, and they also create this invulnerability, this relative invulnerability that we need actually to be alive. Like nature, the wilderness, our inner wilderness and the outer wilderness, it is a mesh of all kind of creatures that need to live together, and they have to support each other, so they have to find a sort of peace, and that peace is being described in Chinese medicine as harmony, while in Western medicine what is seen is like this material here, material there, and they have to be in balance with each other. If the balance is good, then the life can continue. And balance and harmony is not the same. One of the things when you look at the wilderness metaphor is that nature doesn't do anything too much. It doesn't really think because it doesn't really need to think. And there is this intelligence developing over time in nature, in how there's all kind of smart cooperation between animals. You see that in the animals as an individual, they think and they feel and they communicate with other animals, but as a species, you know, you cannot really say like they're super smart or something like this. You see the same with human beings. We do all the things that all the animals do. We do something faster than some other animals because we think faster, but our thinking is not that much different, even though we have more capacity to sing our territorial songs. And that is also why I very often call science, like art and like a lot of the popular literature, gossip culture. Like many animals, they just gossip with each other to create natural territorial bounds, like the starling who is singing every morning, singing with another bird over there and another bird over there, just to make sure that everybody knows what is their boundaries. And this is how nature functions. This is the intelligence of nature. This is the mutual agreements and the way how cats make appointments with each other about who is going out, what time. I see it even between the two cats in my house, and they are arguing and they are cooperating, and they have agreements about what they do, and sometimes they go out together, they maybe even go hunting together, and sometimes they go out one by one because they want to have the privacy to do their thing. Ironically, I'm not a big fan of Darwin as a whole because I don't believe so much in evolution. I think that nature is diversifying just to make sure that this cooperation is smooth and that holes in the mesh are being filled up with animals and plants which could do that better than other ones, or because there's nobody there, animals or plants, they see an opportunity to develop into a particular direction, and sitting in that niche, they become an independent species. So you can't really call this evolution, you just can call it diversification, and this diversification is the filling of the net. But one of the things also that Darwin came up with is that nature follows particular kind of rules, and nature is not very generous in reinventing new things. It just keeps on reinventing the same principles, and something that you see happen once, you see happen twice or 3 times or 4 times, like all the leaves of trees and a lot of other plants. They are more or less built according to similar kind of rules. The stems of trees all over the world more or less have a comparable cellular structure. All the animals, mammals, reptiles and so on, they have more or less the same body plan. There's no animals like reptiles with 6 legs, like you always see in the sci-fi movies or cartoons. You only see reptiles with 4 legs. At least if there is one, please show me. You see that all the animals, they have a tail, they have a body plan, basically with 5 or 6 limbs, but mostly with 5 limbs, where you see 2 legs or 4 legs and a head, and you see the 5 fingers and toes, and you see 5 senses, sometimes 6 senses, sometimes 4 toes, sometimes 3 toes, but all the senses are always present one way or the other, and the way how they're being integrated with each other provides specialization in this direction or that direction. Like an octopus has eyes which are way better than human eyes, and they have an intelligence which is based on 3-dimensional thinking. Like dolphins also have that, but in a very different kind of way. And humans, we have a sense of 3-dimensional thinking, but we are 2-dimensional species. We learn to think, you know, by making airplanes and going to space and stuff like this. But in essence, our life experience is 2-dimensional. If you ask people to become continuously aware of the space around them, you know, that space around them is basically this space. But that space is usually forgotten because that seems to be so abstract. And for Chinese culture, that space actually was a very important part, but it was very hard to access. They realized it's very hard to access. What the theory of Darwin, though, underscored is that these interdependencies, what Buddhists and Taoists also talk about, also is very relevant in biology. And when you let go of the idea of evolution and you talk about diversification and networking between the different species, then at that moment you start realizing, like, okay, this is what wilderness is all about, and that is also taking place in ourselves. Our internal biome is just in the same way, it is diversifying, and it needs this diversification, and we are dependent on this diversification, otherwise we just basically collapse. In a way, you can see also that in that sense our inner biome, like nature outside, is a historical record. It shows basically the evolution of mankind over time, and it lives with ghosts inside itself, in the sense that these are places where something used to live that has been gone extinct. So now at this moment we live with a lot of ghosts, which are the result of our antibiotics. And in Chinese medicine, ghosts are a very important infectious agent, because if a ghost infects you, it's very difficult to get rid of it, and that is an interaction between the Hun and the Po, and these ghosts, they create diseases inside you, and they